In the depths of a Maine forest in the late autumn of 1775, a column of starving American soldiers sat down in the snow and ate their shoes. They had already boiled and swallowed the last of their candle wax and the leather from their cartridge boxes. And now they were cutting their moccasins into strips, charring them over the fire, and choking them down because there was nothing else left to eat. One group, further along the trail, killed and ate a dog that had followed the army the whole way, and the men who got none of the meat scooped up the leftover bones and the feet and boiled them into a thin gray broth. They were hundreds of miles deep into a wilderness that no map showed correctly, in falling snow, with no real idea how much further they still had to go. And here is the part that is almost impossible to take in. This was not the disaster. This was only the road to it. These men were not dying in a wilderness for nothing. They were marching, on foot and half dead, to attack one of the strongest fortresses in North America. And when they finally reached its walls, broken and frozen and badly outnumbered, they did not turn around. They attacked. This is the story of the first time the United States, before it was even quite a country, set out to conquer another one. It is the story of an invasion that almost nobody remembers now, aimed at a prize that would have redrawn the entire map of the continent. The target was the British city of Quebec, and the goal was nothing less than to tear Canada away from the British Empire and bring it into the rebellion as the 14th American colony. The men who marched through that frozen wilderness came within a few minutes, and a few terrible strokes of luck, of pulling it off. They failed. But the empire they were trying to humble never came closer to losing its hold on Canada than it did on a snowy night at the very end of that year. And the reason the whole attempt has been forgotten is the same reason most near misses are forgotten. It did not quite work. The idea of invading Canada was born out of the strange, giddy, early months of the rebellion, when almost anything seemed possible. In the spring of 1775, just weeks after the first shots at Lexington and Concord, a small force of Americans had captured Fort Ticonderoga, the old stone fortress that guarded the long water highway of Lake Champlain, running north toward Canada. One of the two men who took it was a sharp, aggressive, intensely ambitious officer from Connecticut named Benedict Arnold, a name that would come to mean one particular thing to Americans many years later, but that in 1775 meant only courage and drive, and a refusal to be beaten. With Ticonderoga in American hands, the door to Canada stood open, and the leaders of the rebellion began to think seriously about walking through it. The reasoning behind the invasion was partly cold military sense and partly warm hope. The military sense was real enough. Canada, and above all the fortress city of Quebec, was the great British base in the north. As long as the British held it, they could use it to pour armies down the Champlain corridor into the heart of the colonies whenever they pleased. Take Quebec, and that door swung shut from the other side. The hopeful part was shakier. The American leaders had half convinced themselves that the French-speaking people of Canada, who had been conquered by the British only 12 years earlier, and who were Catholics in a Protestant empire, were secretly longing to be liberated and would rise up and join the rebellion the moment an American army appeared at their gates. Quebec, in this dream, would simply fall into step as the 14th colony, marching alongside the other 13. It was a comforting idea, and there was just enough truth in it to be dangerous, and nowhere near enough to be relied upon. The plan that took shape was bold to the point of recklessness. Two separate American armies would invade Canada at the same time, by two different roads, and converge on Quebec from opposite directions. The first and larger force would take the obvious route, north up Lake Champlain, past the captured forts, toward Montreal, and then down the St. Lawrence River to Quebec. It was placed under the command of Richard Montgomery, an Irish-born former officer of the British Army who had settled in New York, married into an American family, and thrown in his lot with the rebellion. Montgomery was experienced, capable, and oddly reluctant. A man who took the command out of duty rather than any hunger for glory, and who had a clear and unsentimental eye for exactly how badly things could go. The second force was Arnold's, and Arnold's idea was the wild one. While Montgomery took the long, known road, Arnold proposed to lead a second army straight at Quebec by a route no army had ever attempted, through the trackless wilderness of what is now the state of Maine, up rivers and over mountains and through forests that the British flatly believed no military force could ever cross. If it worked, Arnold would burst out of the woods at Quebec from a direction the enemy thought impossible, while Montgomery came at the city down the river, and the two of them would crush it between them before its defenders even understood what was happening. Washington approved the plan and gave Arnold around 1,100 men, among them a tough company of Virginia riflemen under a huge, hard-fighting frontiersman named Daniel Morgan, along with a pair of young officers, Aaron Burr and James Wilkinson, whose names would each carry a darker weight in American history later on. In September, they set off. The march began in something close to high spirits. Arnold's men sailed up the coast from Massachusetts, turned into the mouth of the Kennebec River, and at the last real outpost of settlement, they transferred into more than 200 flat-bottomed riverboats called bateaux, hastily knocked together out of green, unseasoned wood by a local boat builder who had been given almost no time to do the job properly. The boats were heavy, clumsy, and already leaking when the men climbed aboard them. Arnold believed, based on the only map he had been able to find, that Quebec lay about 180 miles ahead, and that the journey would take perhaps 20 days. He was wrong on both counts, and badly wrong. The true distance was closer to 350 miles, very nearly double what he thought. And the map he was trusting, drawn years before by a British military engineer, was riddled with errors. Whether through honest mistake or deliberate tampering, nobody has ever been quite able to say. The army was walking into a wilderness twice as deep as it believed, in leaking boats that were already falling apart, with winter coming on fast behind them. The wilderness took the expedition apart, piece by piece. The rivers were not gentle highways, but obstacle courses of rapids and waterfalls. And at every fall, the men had to drag the heavy, waterlogged boats and all their supplies up out of the water and carry them overland through forest and bog, sometimes for miles, before putting in again above the falls. The leaking boats ruined what they carried. Barrels of dried fish and bread soaked through and rotted. Casks of gunpowder were spoiled. The flour turned first to paste and then to mold. Between the great rivers lay a stretch of swampy ponds and bogs that the men named the Great Carrying Place, a nightmare of cold black water and clinging mud where the army floundered for days on end. Then the weather itself turned on them. A late hurricane swept up the coast and inland, and the placid dead river the men had been following rose into a brown torrent overnight, flooding their camps, sweeping away boats and food, drowning the trail under feet of water. And behind the hurricane came the snow. As the food ran out, the men began to starve in earnest. They were down to a few spoonfuls of flour a day, and then to nothing at all. They boiled and ate the leather of their shoes and their cartridge boxes. They scraped and swallowed their candle wax. When that dog was killed, the men ate every part of it, the hide and the feet and the bones boiled gray, and counted themselves fortunate to get any of it. Men collapsed on the portage trails and could not get up again. Some drowned when the boats overturned in the rapids, and Morgan himself, the giant Virginian, very nearly went under at a waterfall when his boat smashed apart on the rocks. The cold and the endless wet brought on dysentery and pneumonia, and the worst of the sick had to be left behind in the snow with whatever scraps could be spared, to crawl their own way back or to die where they lay. The wilderness was destroying the army without a single shot being fired. And then, at the lowest point of the whole ordeal, the expedition nearly broke apart entirely. The rear third of the army, under a colonel named Roger Enos, happened to be carrying the largest share of the remaining supplies, and these men, looking at the flooded river and the falling snow and the starving column struggling ahead of them, decided they had simply had enough. Enos held a council with his officers, and after a good deal of argument they turned around and marched back the way they had come, taking with them several hundred men, and, far worse, a great part of the food the rest of the army was depending on to stay alive. For the men still pushing north, it was a betrayal and a death sentence rolled into one, their numbers and their provisions collapsing at a single stroke. Arnold gathered the officers still with him and put the question to them plainly, whether to go on or to give up, and the answer, astonishingly, was to go on. They would drive an advance party ahead at all possible speed to reach the first French-Canadian settlements and bring food back. And the rest of the army would follow as fast as their failing bodies could carry them. Arnold himself raced ahead with a small party, fought through the last of the wilderness, and reached the first farms along the Chaudière River, where he bought every head of cattle and every sack of flour he could lay hands on and sent them back up the trail toward his dying men. That food, arriving exactly when it did, was the difference between an army and a mass grave. The survivors, gaunt and ragged and frostbitten, stumbled out of the forest into settled country above the St. Lawrence in the middle of November. Of the 1,100 men who had set out, barely 600 were left. Several hundred had turned back with Enos. Around 200 more were simply dead, drowned, or starved, or frozen along 350 miles of wilderness. The ones who remained had done a thing the British had flatly believed to be impossible, and even their enemies knew it. A British resident inside Quebec, writing home as the ragged Americans appeared across the river, could scarcely believe what he was looking at, and confessed a grudging awe at men who had come to him, as he put it, across the woods. But awe does not take a city. Arnold looked across the St. Lawrence at the great fortress of Quebec, sitting high on its rock above the river, and looked at his 600 starving men with no heavy guns and barely a dry cartridge among them, and understood that he could not possibly take the place alone. He crossed the river anyway, in canoes and small boats, slipping under the very noses of British warships, and made a show of force before the walls. The city did not so much as flinch, so Arnold pulled back a little way upriver to wait, because the other half of the plan, Montgomery's half, was at last on its way. A short pause before the assault, and a small ask. If you are finding something worthwhile in this, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe and leave a like on the video. It genuinely helps these forgotten stories reach the people who would want to hear them. Now, to the man coming down the river, and the night the whole thing was decided. Montgomery's half of the invasion had gone a great deal better than Arnold's, at least at first. Coming up, Lake Champlain. His army had sat down in front of the main British fort south of Montreal, a place called St. John's, and settled into a long, cold, sodden siege that dragged on for the better part of 2 months through the autumn rain. The little garrison held out with real stubbornness behind its walls, but it was cut off and slowly starved of any hope of relief, and at the beginning of November, it gave in and surrendered. With that fort gone, the whole road to Montreal lay open. The city itself, all but undefended, fell to Montgomery a few days later without a fight. The British governor of all Canada, Guy Carleton, had been in Montreal as it fell and had escaped down the river to Quebec by the very narrowest of margins, slipping past the Americans in disguise in a small boat. Carleton reached Quebec and set at once about turning it into a fortress that could hold through the winter. Montgomery, his own army shrinking by the day as enlistments ran out and men drifted off home, gathered what troops and captured British supplies he could, including badly needed winter clothing for Arnold's freezing soldiers, and came down the St. Lawrence to join the Second Army before the walls of Quebec. In the first days of December, the two American forces finally became one. Together they numbered only about 1,000 men. 1,000 men, in the dead of a Canadian winter, with a handful of light field guns and no proper siege artillery against a walled city perched on a cliff. Carleton's garrison inside was not large either, and it was a strange patchwork of a force. A few hundred British regulars and Marines and sailors, stiffened by local English and French Canadian militia, and a body of tough Scottish Highland veterans under a hard old officer named Maclean, who took charge of the defense. But the defenders had everything the attackers did not. They had high stone walls, dry powder, full storehouses, and a roof over their heads, and all they had to do was wait. Montgomery and Arnold settled in to besiege the place, lobbing the occasional mortar shell over the walls and sending in messages urging the city to surrender. And Carleton simply ignored them and waited for spring. When the river ice would melt and British ships would bring him relief, time was entirely on his side. And then time ran out on the Americans. The American army was built on short enlistments, contracts that bound a man to serve only until a fixed date. And for a great many of Montgomery's and Arnold's soldiers, that date was the 31st of December. At the stroke of the new year, by their own agreement, those men were free to set down their muskets and walk home. And a great many of them plainly meant to do exactly that. Montgomery knew that the moment the year turned, his besieging army would begin to dissolve in his hands, and that whatever chance remained of taking Quebec would dissolve along with it. He could not wait for better odds, or better weather, or fresh troops. It was the city now, in the last days of December, with the men he had, or it was nothing at all. Arnold, who had not dragged 600 men through 350 miles of frozen hell in order to walk away from the walls without a fight, argued hard for an assault. However desperate the odds, the officers came around. They would attack the lower part of the city, down by the river where the defenses were weakest, and they would do it under the cover of the first heavy snowstorm, to hide their movements until the very last moment. The storm came on the night of the 30th of December and into the small hours of the 31st, a true blizzard, the wind driving thick snow flat across the river and the rock. At around 4 in the morning, the Americans moved. The plan was for 2 columns to strike the lower town from opposite ends, Montgomery's from the south and west, Arnold's from the north, and to fight their way through the narrow streets to meet in the middle, then force a path up into the heart of the city. In the howling dark and the snow, almost at once, the plan began to come apart. Montgomery led his column along a tight path between the cliffs and the river toward the first barrier, a blockhouse held by a small group of Canadian militia with a couple of cannon. The defenders were nervous, half expecting nothing at all to come in such weather. Montgomery, who, like Arnold, believed that a commander led from the front, pushed up to the head of his men and urged them forward toward the blockhouse through the snow. At a range of a few dozen yards, the handful of militia inside fired their cannon, loaded with grape shot. A great scattering blast of musket balls sprayed straight down the narrow path. Montgomery was killed instantly, cut down with 2 of his officers beside him in that first volley. The column behind him, suddenly leaderless, the command falling to a quartermaster who had no stomach for the work, turned and fell back into the storm. In the space of a few seconds, half the attack was finished. On the far side of the city, Arnold's column had run into trouble of its own. Coming at the lower town from the north, his men were caught in a storm of musket fire from the walls above them, fire they could barely answer. And almost at the outset, Arnold himself was hit, a ball tearing into his lower leg and shattering the bone. He could not stand, let alone lead, and had to be half carried back through the snow, leaving a smear of blood behind him in the white, arguing the whole way that the attack must go on without him. Command passed to Daniel Morgan, the giant Virginian rifleman, and Morgan attacked with everything he had. His men stormed the first barricade in the lower town, carried it, captured its defenders, and pushed on into the tangle of narrow streets toward the second barrier, which they found, for the moment, all but undefended. The way into the heart of Quebec was very nearly open, and here, at the hinge of the whole night, came the hesitation that lost it. Morgan wanted to push straight on through the second barrier and into the city while it lay open in front of him. His officers held him back. They did not know that Montgomery was already dead and his column gone. They believed the other half of the army was still coming on to join them, and they argued that Morgan should wait where he was, hold his ground, gather in his scattered and lost men, and link up with Montgomery before pressing the final attack home. Morgan, against his own instinct, agreed to wait. It was the worst decision possible, made for sensible reasons, in good faith, on bad information. The delay handed Carleton, inside the city, the one thing he needed most, which was time. The British governor, realizing that Montgomery's prong had collapsed and only Arnold's trapped column remained, rushed men to the second barrier and then sent a force out through a side gate to come around behind the Americans and cut off the narrow streets at their backs. By the time Morgan tried to move again, the way forward was strongly held and the way back was closed. His men were trapped in the frozen lanes of the lower town, surrounded on every side, fighting from doorways with no hope of escape and no help on the way. They held out as long as men could, and then, with nothing left to do, they surrendered. Morgan, weeping with rage, is said to have refused to hand his sword to a British officer and to have given it instead to a priest. More than 400 men were taken prisoner. The numbers told the whole story of the disaster. The Americans had lost around 60 men killed and well over 400 captured. The very heart of the army that had survived, the wilderness, now sitting in British cells inside the city. It had come all that way to take. Carleton's defenders, snug behind their walls, had lost a mere handful, 5 dead and a dozen or so wounded by most accounts. It was the first major defeat of the war for the Americans, and one of the most lopsided of the whole conflict. The British, to their credit, treated their dead enemy with honor. They recovered Montgomery's body from the snow on New Year's Day and gave him a proper military burial inside the city, a mark of respect for a brave opponent. And outside the walls, what was left of the invasion did not even have the mercy of a clean ending. Arnold, his leg shattered, flatly refused to lift the siege. And through the rest of that brutal winter, the broken American army sat in the snow outside Quebec, achieving nothing, while smallpox swept through its camps and killed far more men than the British ever had. When spring finally came, and the river ice broke, and British ships came sailing up loaded with fresh troops, the Americans gave it up at last and began the long, sick, miserable retreat back the way they had come. Canada would stay British. There would be no 14th colony. And yet the thing came so close. That is what stays with anyone who looks hard at the assault on Quebec, once the snow settles and the noise of it dies away. For all the suffering of the march, for all the deep flaws in the plan, the city itself very nearly fell on that one snowy night, and the whole future of a continent very nearly tipped the other way. 3 small things, any single one of them, would have been enough to change it. Had the nervous militia in that first blockhouse fired a moment too late, Montgomery lives, and his column pours into the lower town from the south. Had the ball that shattered Arnold's leg flown an inch wide, He keeps his command instead of Morgan inheriting a half-formed attack in the dark. Had Morgan trusted his own instinct and pushed through the open second barrier in those first few minutes, instead of pausing to wait for a dead man's army, the road into the heart of the city was there for the taking. Any one of those, and Quebec might well have fallen, and Carleton with it, and the map of North America that the world now takes for granted, with its long, quiet border between two separate countries, might never have been drawn at all. Taking the city that night was only ever going to be the first hard step, and holding Canada through the spring, against the British ships and armies that were certain to come, would have been harder still, and might have failed regardless. The dream that the French Canadians would rise as one and join the rebellion had already shown itself to be mostly just that, a dream. The invasion was a long shot built on hopeful assumptions, and long shots usually miss, but this one did not miss by much. It missed by a few seconds of grape shot in a blizzard, by the chance flight of a single musket ball, by one cautious decision taken in good faith in the dark. The most powerful empire on Earth kept its grip on Canada, not through any great strategy or overwhelming weight of force, but because, on the last night of 1775, a handful of small things happened to break its way rather than the other. This is the part of the story that reaches out past the snow and the muskets. The men who marched to Quebec did something very close to superhuman. They crossed a wilderness that everyone had told them could not be crossed, on rotting boats and bleeding feet, eating their own shoes, leaving a fifth of their number dead in the forest behind them. And they arrived at the end of it and attacked a fortress anyway. By any measure of effort, of courage, of sheer refusal to quit, they earned a place among the great feats of arms in their country's history. And they lost, and so they were very nearly forgotten. That is the hard, unsentimental truth sitting underneath this whole story. Effort is not the same thing as success, and the world remembers the second far more readily than the first. A great deal of how any effort is finally judged comes down not to how much was suffered or how hard it was tried, but to whether, at the one decisive moment, a few small things beyond anyone's control happen to fall the right way. The line between the legendary and the forgotten is far thinner than it looks from the outside, and it is very often not a line that the people on the field get to draw for themselves. Today you can drive Benedict Arnold's route through Maine on quiet two-lane roads, past ponds and rivers and gas stations that still carry his name, through country that looks, once you step away from the road, very much as it looked when his starving men dragged their boats through it. The wilderness they nearly died in is mostly silent now, and the city they nearly took sits peaceful and lovely above its river, the capital of a province of a country that exists, in part precisely because their attack failed. Of the men who made that march, history would deal out strange and uneven fates. Daniel Morgan, taken prisoner in those frozen streets, would be exchanged in time and would go on to win one of the most brilliant victories of the entire war at a Carolina cattle pasture called Cowpens. Benedict Arnold, the man whose iron will had carried the whole expedition through the wilderness, who had earned as much glory on that one march as any soldier in the army, would a few years later betray his country so completely that his very name became the American word for a traitor, and the wound in the leg he took at Quebec would end up one of the few parts of him his countrymen could still bring themselves to honor. Richard Montgomery, killed in the first volley of all, would be remembered as a martyr, his name given to towns and counties across the nation he had died trying to enlarge. The failure of the invasion was not quite the end of the story, in the strange arithmetic of war. Driven out of Canada, the broken army fell back to Lake Champlain, and there Arnold, his leg still mending, refused to simply sit and wait for the British to come and finish the job. He threw together a ragged little fleet of small warships out of green timber and sheer stubbornness, And in the autumn of 1776, he fought the pursuing British Navy in a desperate, doomed action at a place called Valcour Island. He lost the battle and lost most of his boats with it. But he had forced the British to halt their advance, to stop and build a proper fleet of their own before they dared come on. And in doing so, he had cost them an entire season of campaigning. That lost season turned out to matter far more than anyone could have known at the time. It pushed the Great British invasion from Canada back by a full year, into 1777, where it would march south and end in total catastrophe at a place called Saratoga, the victory that finally brought France openly into the war on the American side. The long road to that triumph ran, by a crooked and unlikely path, straight back through the snow outside Quebec. They had reached for something enormous, an entire country, the whole northern half of a continent, and they had very nearly closed their hands around it before it slipped away from them in the snow. The first American invasion ended in failure, in a frozen ditch beneath the walls of Quebec, and the empire it had dared to challenge breathed out and held on to Canada for another long lifetime. It is one of the great forgotten near misses of history, and the men who made it deserve to be remembered, not because they won, because they did not, but because of what they were willing to endure for the chance of it. If this story showed you a corner of that war you had never seen before, the kindest thing you can do is press the like button and subscribe, so that the next one finds its way to you the moment it lands. There is a great deal more still on the way. And if you are not quite ready to leave the trail here, there is another video waiting for you on the screen right now that picks up the path and carries it a good deal further. Start it whenever you like, and I will be there when you do.